welcome to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. For this episode, we've been reading The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Katherine Arden, which was a listener's suggestion. It was sold to us as a fantasy novel about the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me are Chris Kempshall and Jessica Meyer. So, as the shells fall in Flanders, a decorated Canadian nurse, Laura Iven, searches for her brother Freddie, who is believed to have been killed in an attack on a series of pillboxes during the Passchendaele offensive in 1917. Laura herself, injured in France when a hospital was shelled, is back in Canada when a package arrives containing her brother's jacket. Laura agrees to work in a private field hospital run by Mary Borden so she can return to France to find out what has happened to her brother Freddie. Crucially, the hospital is behind the lines but in the militarised area known as the Forbidden Zone. Joining Laura and Mary is Penelope Shaw, Pym, whose son James is missing in France. The plot hinges around a mysterious character called Faland, who runs an elusive hotel with no set location that men find to drink and relax. Freddie, who's survived being buried with a German soldier called Winter, is now trapped in the hotel, forced every day to tell Faland a story from his memories. Rather than fantasy like Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, I would suggest this is much closer to the urban fantasy of perhaps Neil Gaiman. With over 800 reviews on Amazon, it scores 4 out of 5 stars. The Guardian described it as well-researched, beautifully written. This is a compelling and memorable novel. So I think before we go any further, I think if people don't want any spoilers, they probably better stop here, because I suspect from now on in, it'll be just wall-to-wall spoilers. Now, I came up with a possibly daft idea of coming up with a one-word review before we start, which might give some people an indication of which way we're leaning. Shall I start my one-word review after a lot of hand-wringing and looking at truncated words and hyphens, but mine boiled down to disappointing.
So I've really struggled with this, and I'm still struggling with this. So if I can take a bunch of other words and then just connect them with hyphens.
We say it in German, just sort of lump it together.
Yeah. Whatever the German word for better than in Memoriam is.
Ooh, I'm not sure I'd agree with that, actually.
No, I wouldn't either. Can I go with 2 words?
Hyphenate them.
Which is fanfic.
Oh, that's interesting.
And also, actually, fanfic is you generally use as one word, so I reckon you can get away with that.
Okay, well, yeah. That one's deliberately ambiguous. I don't want people to take that as a positive or negative, because there's some fantastic fanfic out there. I do, however, agree with Angus's one-word review as well on this one.
And whose fan fiction are we aping?
It's not so much the particular fandom. You know, in the In Memoriam line, I wonder if there's a weird sort of, is there a Robert Graves fanfic out there, which is slightly worrying? But it's more the language. The use of the word huff as a verb is something that I associate deeply with fan fiction, and it drives me insane. I am astonished that The Guardian called it beautifully written.
So I made a note that you might be astonished that they called it well-researched.
We can come to that. She's clearly read The Forbidden Zone, Mary Borden. There is one character that you didn't mention, which is Mary Borden. The nurse is a character in this, and she has read The Forbidden Zone. I'm not sure what else she's read.
I was fairly certain that the sound that I could hear over the last week, like a weird kind of background noise, was Jessica making notes.
I read this 2 weeks ago, so it was me maybe resisting thinking about this again.
Well, yes, I did wonder. I did wonder if you had a list of problematic nomenclature for hospitals and aid stations.
So my current hill that I will die on of there were not field hospitals in the First World War. Certainly not by 1917, 1918. They were casualty clearing stations. That I think was the thing that irritated me most. It fell into the trap, and it's a real challenge for historical fiction, right? You want to give the background. If your setting is 1917, 1918, you can't compact everything that happens in 1914, 1915, 1916 into 1917, 1918. You can't have people learning new things about the war that they would have already known at that point. There's an awful lot of attitudes towards the war which either reflect 1929 disillusionment or reflect something in 1915 when people didn't know what had happened. And it's also almost as if none of the battles before Passchendaele had happened. And that might work for the Americans if she'd made these characters Americans, but it's not going to work for Canadians. It really isn't.
We have a slightly odd, she's an American writer writing a Canadian setting, obviously in a European war, which I thought was interesting. And I got no further with sort of going down that rabbit hole, but I thought it was an interesting set of perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, she clearly wanted to include Halifax, which I was quite excited about. Adrian Gregory gave the most wonderful lecture on the Halifax explosion, oh God, years ago now, well before the pandemic. He came and gave the RHS annual lecture at Leeds on that during the centenary period. It was fantastic. And it really is. It's a very little known moment in the history of the war. And I thought, oh, fantastic. And then she doesn't really deal with it.
It's the largest explosion before the atomic bomb.
Hiroshima bomb, yeah.
The only Canadian fiction of the war, the really sort of important, influential Canadian fiction of the war that I know of, is Ellen Montgomery's Rilla of Ingleside, which is a classic, and it gets slightly subsumed as a First World War novel by being chronologically the final book in the Anne of Green Gables series. So everyone sort of forgets that it's a First World War novel, except for various, there's been some quite good scholarly analysis of it as the Canadian First World War novel. And it's really good. It's really good social history. Montgomery lived through the war herself. She wasn't the age of her protagonist, so I think that's quite interesting. And it covers all 4.5 years of the war. So tracing those patterns of emotion and reaction, it's not the soldier's story, it's the home front story, is really interesting. It's very clear that, sorry, I'm forgetting the author's name of The Warm Hand of Ghosts.
Katherine Arden.
Katherine Arden hasn't read that because there's sort of no reflection of those shifting, complex, really interesting reactions to the war.
It does sometimes fall back on those tropes I set up with my trope bingo with my notes, and you've got rain, chateau generals, shot for cowardice, nurses, loss of innocence, shaking hands with hands sticking out of trench wall as men move to the front. It's kind of a bit tick, 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 tick. I did then felt a bit guilty having drawn up that list, that perhaps you need that thing for a modern audience to actually set the scene for them, which then they all become self-perpetuating, which is slightly frustrating for doing something new.
Yeah, I've wondered about that for a while, the extent to which there's a chicken and egg thing going on with popular portrayals of the First World War. And I think I've probably mentioned it to people before, that a large part of my experience of the centenary was giving the public exactly what they wanted, which was the thing that they've always wanted, regardless of where it came from and the veracity for it. So I wonder whether or not, to make an odd comparison, whether or not we've reached a situation similar to the Battle of the Somme documentary, where if you don't stage the scenes of the guys going over the top, it's not going to look believable. And if you don't put these things that people contain in their heads about the First World War in the book, they're not going to believe it's a First World War book.
But it is possible because there is that very good book that we read a couple of years ago.
Blasted Things?
Which was not tick box. That was the joy of it.
And yeah, I hugely enjoyed that book, but it's probably not had the sales of, say, In Memoriam or The Warm Hands of Ghosts. And whether or not that's because of author name recognition or not, I wonder whether or not, to make it big selling a First World War novel, you have to write a First World War novel.
She was a very well-established literary author. It was also a literary novel. I mean, it's marketed as a genre novel.
And that might be the issue.
Yeah, and In Memoriam had a huge amount of publicity.
Which is still rumbling on at times, I've noticed.
Yeah, well, it's come out in paperback.
That'll be it.
In Memoriam is better than this. Shall we be perfectly honest?
I was reflecting on this, and I think that's because it's so fast paced as In Memoriam. It's unbelievably fast paced that any fault that you have with it is gone and passed so fast that you forget the little problems that you have with it, because it just cracks along really, really quickly.
Well, no, I'll tell you why In Memoriam is better than this. Is the characters were deeper. There was better characterization.
Yeah, I can probably get on board with that. I mean, the more I think about In Memoriam, the more annoying I find it, because I think that a lot of the things attached to In Memoriam is basically it's borrowing from better books. I think we spoke in our previous episode, that at times it comes remarkably close to a form of plagiarism. And that's the problem I have with In Memoriam, is that when I'm reading In Memoriam, I'm also reading other books at the same time.
But at least we can identify what the other books are. Whereas this, I think what frustrates me is that it's not even repeating other books, it's repeating tropes. There's no depth to it. It's a deeply Fussellian, as in Paul Fussell, view of the history of the war. It's a profoundly American interpretation of the history of the war. And there's no sort of interest or curiosity in any other perspective.
I can understand that, yeah.
Whereas the historian in me gets really frustrated with that. The other thing I say she's read Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone. She then makes Mary Borden a character. First of all, it's really, really problematic to have one historical character and then to take the other historical character. So she's got this General Gage, who her notes say is based on General Gough, but she's got Mary Borden as Mary Borden.
Yeah, so you've crossed the streams.
So it's either one or the other. Either you're going to have actual historical characters and try and make them believable, or you fictionalize historical characters, because she does a huge disadvantage to Mary Borden. And I'm now going to suggest that listeners go out, get a copy of The Forbidden Zone and read that, because it's extraordinary. As a work of modernist literature, it is just extraordinary. And yes, various wounded characters, Mary Borden brings them to life in a way that they're not brought to life in this book. So if you want a recommendation of a read, don't read this book. Go and read Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone. I'll give it that it might get a really great work of modernist literature a bit more attention, although The Forbidden Zone is quite well known. And then the characters were so flat, and they're all called sort of Jones or Smith, except for the central characters who have more interesting names.
How do you feel about the injection of the fantasy? I mean, I think it is more of that urban Neil Gaiman sort of fantasy element.
I'd have liked it to have been creepier. I thought that, and again, there's an element of, damning with faint praise, that once you kind of understood the conceit of Faland and his hotel, it became a little by the numbers. It could have been creepier. It could have been more unsettling. It could have been, if not necessarily more fantastical, a slightly kind of reworking of the balance between, oh, this is a bit weird, and this is actually unsettling. I think could have been attempted, because there is no specific real peril for, and I've forgotten, is it Neville?
Freddie,
that's it. It's an English name.
But he tells you the depth of characterization, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. And, let's not, I don't want to kind of get into a situation where my one-word review suggests that this is my favourite book. It might say more about how much I disliked In Memoriam and continue to do so. But, okay, he's trapped in the hotel and with the devil, effectively. And he's got to tell these memories. And this is all spoilers, but Angus warned people earlier on. And the devil will use the emotion of them to create music that will in some way distress and or move people. And Freddie can't leave the hotel unless he chooses to do so with his own volition. And that continues to be the case for like 9 chapters in a row. There could have been some horror in there, some actual horror.
But there sort of is, right towards the end, it shows you how Faland is manipulating the war. But that's not really there earlier on, which I kind of thought was a shame, because it's quite interesting, this idea of a third party manipulating actions in the war, which is why I thought of sort of Neil Gaiman and the sort of Sandman-esque type characters manipulating things in the background to sort of create horror and confusion for their own enjoyment. It's all almost sort of the level of sort of Greek myth.
But I take Chris's point that the Neil Gaiman does it fantastically. It is horrifying. That is the emotion. This didn't move me particularly. I was trying to remember what this does give me is the excuse to again recommend one of my absolute favorite histories of the war, which is Owen Davies' A Supernatural War, which is just a wonderful, wonderful history of all of this, the myth, the superstition, the rumors, all of this stuff that was there. And that's, I think, quite sad. This imbued the battlefields and the home fronts as well. Fussell, the unheimlich, the uncanny. And we sometimes forget that as historians, I think. We're looking for truth, reality, lived experience, whatever it is. And that sense of strangeness, uncanniness, and the need to explain it and the mythologizing of it was far more widespread than I think comes across in a lot of the histories. Owen Davies gets that. And that's what I wanted from this. And it wasn't there. And there was the weird figure of the ghost mother who haunts Laura, who sort of pops up at convenient points. So it's a very specific haunting. And you never get a sense of the nightmares. What was quite interesting was the lack of shell shock in this, actually. This is not a book that tries to deal with psychological trauma, which did cause nightmares. It literalizes them in ways that sort of write that psychological trauma out in an interesting way.
Though oddly, one of the reviewers on Amazon points to it being a book all about mental trauma and PTSD and thought the whole book was an allegory for it, which, to be honest, I never got that, but I thought it was interesting that somebody else did.
No, I didn't either.
Oddly, I thought it was more of an allegory for drug addiction and self-loathing and than necessarily shell shock.
I'm afraid I didn't get any allegory at all. But I can back to Chris's point about this being a book about what we expect. It ticks all the boxes of expectation, and we expect PTSD, which is not PTSD.
We should really get merch made up with that on, like oh, what a lovely podcast t-shirts with
it's shell shock, not PTSD.
In regards to
no field hospitals.
to Faland and that kind of, if we kind of that Neil Gaiman-esque thing, because you end up at one point with a portrayal of him, so the TV series Luther, which is based off of Neil Gaiman's Lucifer, not Luther, off of kind of the Sandman universe, as like a vision of the devil who doesn't like taking responsibility for the sins of humanity, because that's not the devil didn't tell anybody to do this stuff. And you get a slight element of Faland at one point as I've got to live with the horrible, horrible things that you're doing to each other. But it lasted for like half a chapter or so before it then became, this slightly kind of manipulating events. But there could have been like something quite interesting in that, the idea of, which again exists within a slightly older historiography of the First World War being like the original sin of the 20th century. So sinful is it, even the devil must turn his gaze away. It's very tropey, but if done right, could be interesting.
Well, that whole Faland sort of storyline in that liminal space of the Forbidden Zone is actually quite a good setting for a story. It's perhaps not really developed enough because we've got this other story of Laura trying to find her brother, which almost upsets what could be a really interesting story of something a bit sort of off kilter. But perhaps that's a bit too comic book for something that's trying to be a bit more literary. Or
maybe the kind of the reframing of, this is a First World War Dante's Inferno of, traveling through no man's land as traveling through purgatory kind of sense, but it's not really there.
Because I really enjoyed the setting. I thought it was a really interesting setting, that sort of liminal space it was in. And it allowed quite a lot of freedom for her to discuss. Winter, the soldier who was buried with Freddie, finds himself on the run trying to help Freddie, but on the British side of the lines in this liminal space. And that was really interesting, how he could survive and move, and the British are trying to track him down. And this is all set just before the German Spring Offensive, which again I thought was an interesting sort of point to set it, because it adds a jeopardy that they think something's going to be happening, and they think that Winter, this German who is on the loose behind the lines, is a spy, so they're trying to track him down. So I enjoyed very much the physical geography of the space that it was setting. I thought it was really good.
I actually struggled with the geography a little bit. So Laura travels by motorbike at one point, and I wasn't clear where the hospital, and let's call it a hospital, but well, no, for the sake of the problem with her depiction of the status of Borden's hospital. There are a number of problems with it, but the two main ones are one, its relationship to the militaries. And I really needed to go and take a look at my copy of Forbidden Zone. I should have done that before this episode, but I was away last week. She was attached to the French military, which is true of a lot of British-run independent hospitals. The British Army Medical Services and the British military are really resistant to working with independent hospitals, which includes a lot of the women's run hospitals. So the Scottish women's hospitals do get incorporated into the British Army Medical Services eventually, but they start in Serbia because the Serbian army is the only one who are willing to take their help initially. And then the French come on board, and it's very much about if a country is occupied, their medical services tend to be decimated. They will take help from anywhere. And one of the things that these independent hospitals end up doing is a lot of she talks briefly about the maternity work, but actually the Scottish women's hospitals, Mary Borden's hospitals and the like, they're not just looking after war casualties, they're looking after the civil populations that have no other medical resources. So it's everything. It's accidents, it's childhood illnesses, it's, the farm worker who is gored by a bull. It's everything. And that means that they are located very much in the civil populations. And this is where something like R.H. Mottram's The Spanish Farm trilogy is brilliant in giving a sense of these liminal spaces that's very different from the one we have here. These are occupied liminal spaces because there's civilians still there. They never completely get rid of the civilian populations. The French are deeply, deeply attached to their terroir. This is Pierre Pursegle's argument in his work that they stay. They do not move off the farm if they can help it, whatever is happening. And we saw that actually in Women at War. So part of the reason that that Faland's hotel, which is uncanny, I agree with you, Angus. I think that the sense of place in the hotel is really interesting. But it could be more uncanny if the real world were more of the reality of this place with people in it, with roads that are difficult to travel along, where distances make more sense. And I never got a sense of the physical space of Poperinghe at any point. We're told, not shown.
I think part of the problem with distance is that it kind of gets hand waved away because she's scooting on a motorbike. So there's an acceptance that you could just zip about behind the lines on a motorbike, which I'm sure it was not like at all on these muddy roads. But at the same time, you've got to deal with the fact that Faland's geography specifically doesn't work because it's mystical. People sort of walk into the darkness and arrive somewhere because of the nature of his hotel being sort of ethereally moving around and only being where it needs to be. It's almost a separate dimension that he's operating in. So the whole geography and space sort of does, as you said, breaks down. In one context, it's not meant to work. For Faland, it's mystical, and the other is just hand waved away. We've got a motorbike. That's fine. We can get anywhere on the Western Front. We've got a motorbike.
When they go to the dinner with the general, he's in a chateau miles behind the line. Well, how are they getting there then? Where is he behind the line? And actually, of course, the generals weren't miles behind the line.
No.
But he has to be in a chateau.
Of course he has to be in a chateau, and they have to have more food. Oh, chickens. This was the point that I lost all sense of suspension of disbelief, was when they eat a chicken and there's some comment about it being sort of not very exotic or not very fancy food, which is a very late 20th, early 20th, 21st century perspective on food. Chickens would have been luxury food before the war,
Certainly during it.
absolutely during it, and for a certain period of time after it. You know, working class people might eat eggs. Rachel Duffett in The Stomach for Fighting has a lovely bit in the introduction where she's talking about working class eating patterns, where she talks about a working class family, if they had eggs, the father get the egg to eat, and they might give their child as a treat the top of the egg. But that's where the protein goes. It goes to or if you had a chicken, you might have a chicken for Sunday. This is where the Sunday roast comes from, right? But then you make it last the rest of the week. My God, it becomes leftovers and stock and everything you can imagine. But yeah, no, chicken is not sort of plain everyday food. Anyway, that was one of my points of going, this isn't carrying me back to the First World War.
So I've just checked my notes. There is not a word. I did not note anything about chickens in my notes. Many things I made a note of. Chicken wasn't one of them.
Can you tell I'm a social historian?
How do you feel about the character Winter? I thought it was a massive missed opportunity. I thought he was potentially quite interesting. The German character Winter, who thankfully had served as a waiter in Brighton before the war, so could speak English and talk to Freddie, who clearly can't.
And then he can magically do things with one arm. His arm has been amputated at the shoulder, and then he's tying a tourniquet.
Yeah, presumably with his feet.
I think at the end, or his teeth, maybe. God knows. Anyway.
Interesting. It amused me as well that Winter could, of course, speak English, but Freddie can't speak German. Typical. But I just thought it was a bit of a missed opportunity. The two of them buried in the trench, buried in the pillbox, getting out and moving through no man's land, I thought I was quite gripped by it. I was slightly disappointed that they seemed to be they were only every other chapter.
Yeah, and it ended quite quickly.
Because they're very short chapters. If you want a book to read in the tube, the chapter lengths are perfect, very, very short. So you skip from scene to scene quite quickly. And I was always slightly disappointed that we were taken out of those trenches with Winter as they're escaping. We went back to Canada. Then we got back and where are they? How are they going to escape? But then Winter almost seems to disappear from the book after they first break out together and arrive back in the Forbidden Zone, which I thought was a shame.
And he then is smuggled out to Canada. Does he have a family in Germany?
So it gets mentioned about he signed his farm over to his brother-in-law or brother or something like that, and it's implied that therefore there's nothing for him to go back to. But he's also older, so I don't think he has kids. I don't think there's any mention of those. But the idea that he doesn't want to go, I'll just go to Canada then.
Yeah, he seems happy to uproot himself, and there's very little distinguishing about the characters. There's a stock doctor character called Jones, who's American, and that's about all that can be said about him. There's nothing else to him, right?
For a while, for like the first couple of chapters that he appeared in, I was wondering if this was going to be like an extended religious metaphor, with Faland being the devil and Jones being God or something like that. This slightly kind of bristly, but he was there to just do a thing. He was going to make a few people better as a doctor because it was the only thing that he could do in those circumstances, and he was just going to be like a guy who was there. And I wondered if that, and then it just turned out it wasn't. But I wondered for a while, it kind of dangled there as in, maybe Jones is the balance to Faland. No, he's just a doctor.
That would have been fun. Very sort of Homeric, having two sort of gods there sort of competing.
And I had a similar feeling about the three sisters who are very much Deus Ex Machina, because they end up leaving Laura the house.
These are the ladies at the start who have the seance.
Which, first of all, Laura's attitude to seances is more post-war than I think it is wartime. This is when I started thinking about Owen's book. But yeah, they could have been fantastic characters within this, but then they just sort of, all they're there to do is leave Laura a house at the end.
Because Jones is the person that she confesses things to, that the person that she tells backstory to that she doesn't tell anybody else. He's the person who treats her wounds and the like, and it felt like there was going to be more to him than he just happened to be a convenient doctor who apparently is handsome, but in a way that we don't actually know what he looks like.
And thereby becomes the love interest. So So this was a very frustrating book.
It's making me want to go back and read Blasted Things, actually, which was really enjoyable, and rewatch Women at War.
Yeah, but also, I mean, I'm serious about read Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone. There is a lot of horror in that, body horror in particular, actually.
How do you feel about the injection of fantasy? I mean, it was sold to us as a fantasy book, and I suspect we all started it not quite knowing where the fantasy was going to be, because it takes quite a while for the fantasy element to sort of start. And I'm not sure how many other fantasy books have been written with the First World War. Is there?
I'm now thinking, and you're right, it is. So there's some interesting stuff from the war itself. Zombies and cyborgs turn up in some of the short fiction that emerged during the war years itself. Kate MacDonald's written some interesting stuff about that. A lot of body horror type things.
There's a trilogy of books that I've got and read that, annoyingly, the series has never actually finished. But they're pulp sci-fi-esque novels about the First World War of like a battalion, I think, on the Somme. There's an explosion and they get transported to an alien world. And they have to survive on this alien world. And it turns out some of the Germans got transported in the explosion with them. And they are very good fun in that kind of, if you aim at pulp sci-fi, it's real hard to miss if you just really lean into it.
I have a feeling there was was it a French, because they do the comic, the graphic novels, they have a much longer tradition, that involved a ghost battalion sometime in the 1990s, I want to say. But there, there's quite a lot of that sort of literature over the years. But when you say fantasy, I'm now having visions. Maybe we need to write a fantasy that involves dragons on the battlefield. Might have to be set on the Eastern Front. But can you imagine?
George R.R. Martin. all men must die. You can see the tropes all falling out already.
I've also got a book called The Bloody Red Baron, which is in like a historical vampire series, where the Red Baron is a vampire and various other combatants in the war are vampires, and that's pretty good fun.
Something about competing magicians on either side is ringing vague alarm bells. Not alarm bells, but memory bells. Maybe that was Second World War set. So, I know what it is. Ben Aronovich, The Rivers of London.
Yeah.
So he definitely has a Second World War setting, but Thomas Nightingale has a First World War record. I need to go back. Peter Grant's, his mentor.
Yes, yeah. I enjoy The Rivers of London as a piece of easy
so Thomas
frippery.
Nightingale is the
central magician character behind the
exactly. But because he's lived long enough, I don't think we've been given details of it yet. So maybe this is a plea to Ben Aronovich. Please, can you flesh out?
You might find, though, Jessica, unless you've read them, that the graphic novels of The Rivers of London might flesh that out. And if you've only read the books, we might have missed that.
I haven't read the graphic novels. I probably need to go and check those before I make that plea. But that would be
But it's interesting that it hasn't really necessarily been used as a fantasy setting. Perhaps the Second World War leans into it easier because you've got this good and bad, black and white,
good and bad
laid out much easier.
And this is, why I loved Supernatural War so much. There is so much capacity for certainly the type of horror fantasy that I think we see here. This could have been really, really good. I think that's one of the sadnesses about this. The idea is fantastic. And I have a feeling that myth of the fiddler is actually one of those genuine First World War rumors. The fiddler who plays music that makes men forget. And there was a whole quite extended things about memory and forgetting that could have been really interesting with a little bit more research into some of the history on memory and forgetting. And that's where the shell shock and trauma element of it come in, that just, it wasn't really there. So yeah, it's, a lot of potential that just isn't done very well.
Because part of the central concept is that he's having to review memories. And I think it's interesting that they'd never necessarily make a lot of this, but there's a lot of it in it. So he's always regurgitating memories of happy memories. And then it's almost as a sort of towards the end, it's pointed out to him that he's only recounting his happy memories and not going over those things that traumatize him.
When he tells the memory, he forgets. And this is where that sense of trying to compact everything into 2 years as if nothing had happened before 1917 really comes out, because all the sort of memories he wants to revisit, which he then forgets, are the ones of his childhood. They're all about Laura. There's nothing about any of his war service before this attack on Vimy Ridge.
Those would be the ones you'd be giving away straight away.
But it's also, did men have no happy memories of the war? In which case, that eternal question that historians of morale ask is, well, how did you get men to carry on fighting for 4.5 years? If everything was relentlessly traumatic all the time, how did you do that? And it wasn't. And if you read enough contemporaneous personal narratives, diaries, letters, all that sort of stuff, even retrospective stuff, even oral histories, there's a lot of, I made good friends. We shared trauma, and that brought us together, and I appreciate the companionship. I can Christmas pudding sent from home never tasted so good after biscuits and plum and apple jam. There is happiness, contentment, enjoyment in war experience. It's really uncomfortable to think about it like that. But that is a fundamental truth about the social history of war, is that some men enjoy fighting.
Yeah, some of them, it was the best thing that ever happened to them.
Yeah, and a lot of men get enormous, and women get a lot out of war experience, whatever that is. And the majority get enough out that they can carry on.
I couldn't help but feel that it would have been better as a short story. I couldn't help feel if Stephen King had written it as a short story, like The Shawshank Redemption is a long film but a short story, it might have focused it more. There'd be a lot would have potentially got jettisoned, and it would have actually been quite interesting and over and done with quite quick. Weird stuff gets inserted, like the Winter and Freddie kissing at the end. You think, where's that suddenly come from? That's an odd thing to.
Oh, that was flagged. It's all the stuff that's told, not shown. We keep on being told how much Freddie loves Winter, and rather told that Winter feels the same, which is why he sticks around and tries to save Freddie, right? And this is where I think In Memoriam did a better job, is in showing that emotional relationship between the central characters across the novel.
So I just thought there had been comrades had been buried together, they'd saved one another's lives. Then at the end, he's suddenly kissing him. It's where the earth did that come from? I missed all that.
There was an awful lot about love in there.
I thought it was about men sharing having a shared experience, surviving it, and trying to keep the other alive.
And if this had been written circa 1929, that would have been it, right? Because love had, that use of love would have had a different meaning. But no, this was...
I just thought it was suddenly a bit odd, and a trope tick dropped it in. I thought, well...
I saw it coming.
Yeah, as I say, short story.
But I agree about that. I agree about the trope tick. Well, I think if you had it as a short story, you'd probably have to omit Laura altogether and Halifax.
Might not be a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it would be, but that wasn't clearly the book she wanted to write.
Well, it did make me wonder what is the book that she was attempted to write, because it's a book in so many odd vignettes that, as I said, some of them could easily have been dropped. What I did think was quite well done is the fact that the timeline, which you think is all running together, contemporaneously together, isn't. So I thought it was quite clever when suddenly you realise it's not, and things that are happening at the start of the book are actually happening somewhere completely differently in Freddie's timeline. And that was a genuine surprise that I thought was quite exciting.
Yeah, I thought that worked because she managed to weave it together quite nicely with the ghost, turning him into a ghost. I thought more could have been made of that. But your point about it being a short story Angus makes me think about why, back to my one-word review of this feeling like fanfic, it's not edited. Nobody's turned around and said to her, this isn't holding together as a plot. Yeah, so it feels really unedited in the way that fan fiction can feel very unedited.
I wonder if this is how I end up kind of balancing my, what I'll refer to as my Warm Hands of Ghosts versus In Memoriam scale. Of Warm Hands of Ghosts, the more I think about it, made me want to read the book I want it to be. Whereas In Memoriam made me want to go and read the books it was based on. And there is a noticeable difference between those two states of being. This book has more potential than In Memoriam. In Memoriam is effectively exactly what I thought it was going to be on the way in. Whereas I can, kind of in keeping with some of the characters, I can see like the ghosts of possibilities of what this could have been that then kind of dissipate along the way.
Although I'm still going to, I think this is the third time I've repeated it. Say, go and read this on the book that it was based on. Go and read the book that this was based on, which isn't what this book is. But I can absolutely see how the Forbidden Zone inspired this book. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think what she did with it was very good.
I think you're right from earlier on that the only solution to this point is now that we're just going to have to write our own fantasy.
Dragons on the Western Front.
Yeah. If each of us do every third word, then
we could do. Is it who are the husband and wife detective novel writers who they write they alternate chapters? Nikki French, I want to say. Is that right? Yes, that's right. Nikki French is the pseudonym of the husband and wife team, Nikki Gerard and Sean French. Anyway, apparently they swap. They write a chapter and then send it to the other person and then back again.
It's a shame that the joint name isn't John French, because then it would be like, and he was also the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Forces between 1914 and 1915.
Yes, well, I should say they don't write, it's not First World War related at all. They write, it's contemporary detective novels and thrillers.
So I think we're pretty not too troubled by the fantasy of it. Just we feel it could have been better.
As I said, there's a lot of literature on the fantasy, supernatural, fantastical, both historically and literary criticism-wise, that emerged from the war itself. So in that sense, writing a fantasy about the First World War makes absolute sense. It was uncanny. Just this isn't the book that did it.
Well, that would seem like a good full stop to our conversation. I think that possibly sums it up for all of us, doesn't it?
Yeah. And Jessica's earned a nice royalties fee for publicising alternative book.
Yes. Well, it's out of copyright now, right?
So I'm not sure we know where we are next time out, do we?
Do you fancy giving another professorial, Jessica? It's great content for us.
We did have on our list demobbed.
I'd be very happy to talk Demobilisation. What could I get you guys to read for Demobilisation? We could read goodbye to all that and have fun with Robert Graves. What do I need to read for my book that I could then make you guys read? Let me have a think.
And then provide you with some notes.
Very good. So we'll keep people posted. So if that is all from us for now, thank you guys.
I think so.
See you soon.
Bye everyone.
Bye.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely